Well, the key writer associated with the area really would be Patrick Galvin. He grew up in the parish, was born and raised here, and he wrote quite a lot about the area. Perhaps the most anthologised would have been My Father Spoke with Swans, which begins with his father standing on the Southgate Bridge at the foot of Barrack Street.
Leaning on the parapet of the Southgate Bridge, my father spoke with swans, remembering his days with the Royal Munster Fusiliers. India was dawn, the women cool, the sun cradled in his arms. Sometimes, when the clouds were wine, he washed his face in the Ganges. The swans rose from the lee and held their wings. Leaning on the mysteries of her twilight room, my mother spoke with God, remembering Pierce and the breath of Connolly. Ireland was new, the men tall, the land mirrored their brightness.
He's got a poem called The White Monument, where he talks about the guards coming down Barrack Street into town. He's got a poem set in the tenement area in Sullivan's Quay, just around the corner from Barrack Street. And in his memoir, Song for a Poor Boy, the area features quite strongly as well. Paddy was born in the late 20s. It's not known exactly when he was born, because Paddy used to say that a poet was somebody who lied with style. I mean, this area was extremely poor right into the late 60s, early 70s. And there were actual tenements here. Houses, buildings which had once been very grand Georgian houses, which had 4 and 5 stories, that had once housed a single family with servants, were now occupied by families staying one to a room. Some of the children would have had no shoes, or running around the street no shoes and unwashed. The buildings were crumbling and falling down. They'd been neglected so long. They were the last wave of tenements to be demolished and people housed in a big social housing program that was built that began in the 60s and went on into the 70s. Well, he grew up in Mary Street. I mean, like all these houses, all those houses would have been occupied by people who were renting, and very few would have been owner occupiers. And the bigger houses would have been occupied by several families at once. So it was a very impoverished place, very, very impoverished. People had no economic power and no political power. So that would have informed his consciousness. On the other hand, they would have had a great community spirit, and they would have had to use humour to survive. And in his memoirs and poems, you have humour totally wrapped up with despair. I mean, The Mad Woman of Cork, many people look upon that poem with affection, quite rightly, but it is a poem about a woman who is completely desperate, completely alone, and it's the absurd elements of Paddy's vision that inform that poem, inform other aspects of his work that seem humorous, but it's always a humour that's used as a defence against despair. He wrote quite a lot about how his parents had sympathies with the Republican cause in Spain, and as I said to you, he was a perfect gentleman, consummate good company. So I was shocked one stage when I went to my local shopkeeper at the end of Barrack Street, around just in French's Quay there, told him how I was publishing the poetry book of Patrick Galvin, and her response was, "The galleys! The galleys! They had the whole parish terrorised!" And poor Paddy did spend some time in reform school. Now I think some people maintained it was for truancy, but from himself and his brothers had the parish terrorised with their, I suppose, their harmless at this by today's standards delinquency. But he grew up with a very strong political awareness, which was brought about not only by his parents' consciousness, but by his own experience of having been incarcerated as a child. And in his autobiography, Song for a Raggy Boy, he suggests that there was a politically aware teacher in the reform school that influenced him a lot and pushed him in a literary direction as well, and probably saved him from further incarceration down the road. But that led him to write one of the most famous political songs, a song about James Connolly, which Christy Moore has covered. And he, it's very difficult to make a living as a poet, so he also started, composing a lot of songs and singing them and recording them. He had a wonderful voice himself, and he wrote plays, all in an effort to make a living for his family. He joined the British military forces in World War II. While people believed he was still too young to join, so that was one reason why he lied about his age. And then afterwards, when he was benefiting from the military pension, it was another reason to keep up that fib. I've never known him to tell a malicious lie. In fact, he was a gentleman. He'd lived most of his life away from Cork. In fact, he had his first book published in 1950s by the Linden Press in London. He was already living in the United Kingdom at that stage. So I was able to get into my early 20s without even knowing he existed. He was brought home at one stage to give a reading. I think that might even have been before he moved to Northern Ireland. And it was only then I discovered him, and I sought out some of his works, and I just... They were a marvel. They were wonderful to discover. They're full of humour and social awareness. Deal with political matters in not heavy-handed way. Many years later, I was trying to start a small poetry press, and I got his permission to assemble most of his poems about Cork in one little pamphlet, and we published it and launched it in the Grand Parade Hotel. Around 1992, and Paddy came down from Belfast, and we had about 200 people turn out for the event, and it was such a revelation to Paddy and his wife Mary that there was so much love in Cork for him and his work at that stage that Mary took it upon her, the idea that they should move from Belfast down to Cork, and that's when he came and resettled in the city. Wrote his memoirs. He'd already written plays as well, of course. And he was a key member of the group that started the Munster Literature Centre and created an organisational infrastructure which allowed writers to continue to live and work in the city. I remember Cork was a very cold place in the 80s for a Cork writer, because you'd be completely ignored by Dublin and Belfast, and there was no infrastructure down here. There's no poetry magazine. There's no organisation that would help and foster your work. And Paddy and his wife Mary were crucial members of a group that began the Munster Literature Centre, and with Mary's energy kept it going from there and helped it grow. And so he lived in Cork for the last 20 odd years of his life, and it was great to have him in the city. I spoke about how Cork was a place that writers went away from. Frank O'Connor talked about how Cork would never be in vain as long as it produced intelligent young people, intelligent enough to actually leave the place. And Gregory Dunne would have been one of those. I mean, he grew up in Ballinlough parish, but he's been a very affecting poem about Elizabeth Fort and about the oldest pub in the city at the corner there. And again, he mentions Barrack Street by name in that poem.
We pass, no she been this, Ireland's oldest licensed premises. Barely glance at the plaque that says, "The Dukes of Wellington and Marlborough drank here." We are going to stand upon the northeast limb of a star. Wellington. Arthur Wellesley never was at ease with his Irish nativity. Of course, sir, to be born in a stable does not make one a horse.
He would have graduated from UCC in mid-70s, went to Canada, got degrees, married there. But he had an early success when he was 24 with a book that was published, and it was nearly 25 years before his second book came out. And unfortunately he died in 2005, just before his last book was due to come out. And mentions Barrack Street. He talks about Barrack Street being a place where tribal songs are sung on a Saturday night. So even though he wasn't from the area, Barrack Street was a crucial part of his idea of what Cork City was about. Well, Frank O'Connor grew up on the north side. His earliest memories would have been living on the north side, but he was born in Douglas Street. His parents rented a first floor flat over what is now the Gables Bar, and his mother's brother had a cobbler shop right across the street. So when it came time for her to give birth, she moved across the road to be looked after by her sister-in-law, and that's where he was born, and that's where his baptismal certificate says he was born. Connor was a man born right at the beginning of the century, 1904. So he grew up experiencing the War of Independence and the Civil War. And he developed into the sort of a man that W.B. Yeats described as the Chekhov of Ireland. By the time he was in his 50s, he'd become quite successful, placing short stories regularly in the New Yorker. And the New Yorker at that stage paid an annual working man's living wage for a single short story. O'Connor went to America and taught in universities there, even though he'd never finished secondary school himself. He was a very, incredibly well-cultured and self-educated man of the lowliest of working-class stock. And the house where he was born actually is, from the outside, a very modest, unassuming building, three-story terraced house. And when it came up for sale, the city council decided they were going to purchase it and develop it as a cultural amenity in honour of Frank O'Connor. So it's not only the place where Frank O'Connor was born, it's also a perfect example of very rare 18th century vernacular urban architecture. And so the Munster Literature Centre, which Patrick and Galvin and Mary Johnson were so assiduous in cultivating and developing, is now based there. We have our offices there and we have a small library. The Munster Literature Centre provides a community hub for the writers of the city. Barrack Street is, I think, it's become such a culturally vibrant place now. I can see it featuring more in other writers and the writers who will be famous tomorrow.